I want to begin by being precise about my own title. Because after what I saw in Asia, I stopped trusting the dollar is a phrase that can be read in a way I do not intend, and the way I do not intend would make the whole reflection worthless. So let me foreclose it at once. When I say I stopped trusting the dollar, I do not mean that I sold everything, fled the currency in a panic, or concluded that it is about to collapse next year. I have not done any of those things, and I do not believe in the imminent collapse. And if you came for a prophecy of the dollar's death, you will not find it here. What I mean is more precise and I think more genuinely interesting, and it is this. I stopped granting the dollar the unconditional, unexamined default trust that I had been granting it my entire life without ever once having decided to. That is what stopped. Not my use of the currency, which continues, but a particular quality of trust, a blind and automatic and total trust that I had never chosen and never examined. And that I came to see after what I observed in Asia was not prudence at all, but the opposite of it. I did not stop using the dollar. I stopped trusting it blindly. And the difference between those two things, between using something and trusting it unconditionally, turns out to be one of the most important distinctions a person can make about money. And it is what I actually want to talk about. Let me be careful, as always, about the two extremes, because this is a subject that pulls people toward one of them, and both are wrong. The first extreme is the one the title seems to promise, the doom narrative, the abandonment of the dollar in fear, the conviction that a currency crisis is imminent, and that the rational response is panic. That is not my position, and it is not what the evidence supports, and I have no interest in joining the long line of people who have predicted the dollar's collapse and been consistently wrong. And the second extreme is the opposite, the absolute and unexamined trust, the treatment of the dollar as a law of nature, so fundamental and so permanent that trusting it is simply the default state of a sensible person. And withdrawing that trust is a kind of paranoia. This is the more common error, and it is more dangerous, precisely because it does not feel like an error. It feels like realism, when it is in fact the unexamined default trust. I am trying to describe, granted not because anyone concluded the dollar was trustworthy, but because trusting it was simply what one did, invisibly, without ever asking the question. The truth is neither panic nor blind trust. The truth is that trust in a currency is a real and contingent thing that can be examined and withdrawn, that withdrawing unconditional trust is not the same as betting on collapse, and that the considered conditional trust that replaces the blind default is the only kind of trust in money that a thinking person should actually hold. So let me start with what money actually is, because you cannot understand trust in the dollar without understanding that trust is not one property of money among others, but the entire foundation on which money rests. A currency is, at bottom, a shared belief. It is trust made liquid, a collective agreement to accept certain tokens as claims on real value, and its worth rests entirely on that agreement, on the trust that it will hold value, that the system managing it is sound, that others will continue to accept it tomorrow as they accept it today. There is nothing intrinsic beneath the trust. A currency is not valuable the way food is valuable or shelter is valuable in itself, by its nature. It is valuable only because it is trusted, only because a vast web of people share the belief that it can be exchanged for real things, and that belief is the whole of it. And this is extraordinarily easy to forget, precisely because the trust is so deep and so universal and so lifelong that it becomes invisible. And the currency comes to feel as though it has intrinsic value, as though the number in the account is a real and solid thing, rather than a claim backed by nothing more and nothing less than trust. But it is trust all the way down. And the moment you see this clearly, the moment you understand that money is a shared belief and nothing else, the question of whether to trust it becomes a real question rather than a settled default, because you realize that your trust is a thing you are granting actively, whether or not you have ever noticed granting it. Now, let me build from this to the dollar's specific position, because the dollar's power in the world is trust operating at the largest scale that has ever existed. The dollar's status as the world's reserve currency is nothing other than the world's trust in the dollar as the safe asset, the thing to hold when you want to hold value, the thing every central bank and every institution and every actor in global commerce trusts to retain its worth. And the exorbitant privilege that this status confers, the ability of the United States to borrow enormous quantities cheaply and to run persistent deficits that no other country could sustain, is precisely what that global trust makes possible, because the world's trust in the dollar creates a structural demand for it that exists independently of the fundamentals, and that demand is the financial expression of the trust. This trust was earned originally by genuine dominance, by the productive and financial and military supremacy of the United States in the period following the Second World War. And it was a trust well-founded at the time. It was established. But here is the crucial thing. Trust, once earned, can persist for a long time on momentum and habit and the sheer inertia of a vast web of people all trusting the same thing, even as the fundamentals that originally justified the trust begin to change. And this persistence of earned trust past the point where the fundamentals justify it is one of the most important and least examined dynamics in the whole of monetary history. The principles that determine how to think clearly about the foundations of the monetary system, how to hold a considered rather than a blind trust in the arrangements you depend on, are worth studying deliberately and as a connected whole. And there's a body of work that lays them out carefully called the Naval Codex. It is not a forecast, and it is not a set of tactics. It is a systematic account of the underlying principles that determine who preserves and builds genuine wealth by seeing the foundations of the financial system clearly rather than trusting them by default. If you want to engage with those principles directly, it is linked in the description, and there is a code on the screen you can scan to reach it. And engaging with the principles directly is what matters, because the principles let you examine your trust rather than granting it automatically. And the examination of trust, as I'm arguing, is the whole of the matter. I want to develop now the single most important thing about trust, the thing that makes it so consequential and so dangerous, and it is this. Trust is soft and psychological, and it can shift faster, far faster than the fundamentals it is supposedly based on. This is the crucial insight, and everything else depends on it. The fundamentals of a currency, the fiscal trajectory, the productive base, the real economic strength beneath it, change slowly over years and decades in ways that are gradual and continuous and visible to anyone tracking them. But trust does not change slowly. Trust is a narrative phenomenon, a matter of confidence and expectation, and confidence and expectation are self-reinforcing and can flip sometimes suddenly, because trust is not about the underlying reality, but about the perception of it and about the perception of everyone else's perception. And these perceptions cascade. A currency can lose trust faster than its fundamentals deteriorate, because trust is the soft psychological layer sitting on top of the hard, slow fundamentals, and the soft layer can move in ways the hard layer cannot. And the gap between them, between the slowly deteriorating fundamentals and the potentially fast-moving trust, is exactly where the danger lives, because the trust can hold on momentum and habit long past the point where the fundamentals justify it, and then when it finally moves, it can move much faster than the fundamentals ever did, because it was never really tracking the fundamentals closely in the first place. It was tracking confidence, and confidence can break. And this is what I saw in Asia, and I want to be careful to describe it accurately because it was not dramatic and it was not a collapse. What I saw was the quiet, rational, deliberate withdrawal of trust by others. Not a panic, not a crisis, but a considered reduction of dependence, the building of parallel payment systems that operate independently of the dollar, the conduct of bilateral trade in non-dollar currencies, the accumulation of gold by central banks, the deliberate construction of alternatives to a system that these actors had decided they trusted somewhat less than they used to. And a great deal of this withdrawal of trust, I came to understand, was driven by a specific and rational cause, which is the observation that access to the dollar system can be weaponized, that it can be denied for political reasons, that it is not the neutral and universal utility it was trusted to be, but a system that can be turned against those who depend on it. And that observation is itself a withdrawal of a particular kind of trust, the trust that the system is neutral and safe and will not be used against you. And when that trust is withdrawn, the rational response is to reduce dependence, to build alternatives, to hold reserves in things that cannot be frozen by political decision. What I saw, in other words, was the early, gradual, rational erosion of the trust on which the dollar's privilege rests, conducted not in panic, but as the sober risk management of actors who had decided that unconditional trust in a single system was imprudent. The way capital actually moves as trust in a monetary order gradually erodes, where it flows and why, and what happens to those who kept trusting unconditionally versus those who withdrew their trust early and diversified accordingly, is worth understanding in its specific mechanics rather than in vague outline. And there is a framework that traces exactly this, called the dragon pivot. Despite the name, it is not really about any single country. It is about how the trust underlying a monetary order shifts across history, what the shift does to those who trusted blindly, and how those who saw the erosion early positioned themselves before it cascaded. You can reach it through the code shown on the screen or through the link in the description for anyone who wants the fuller picture. And that picture matters here precisely because the erosion of trust is so gradual in its early phase that those trusting by default never notice it, right up until the phase when it is no longer gradual. And here is where the observation became personal, where it stopped being about others and became about me, and it is the heart of the whole thing. Watching others withdraw their trust for rational reasons forced me to examine my own trust, which I had never examined, and the examination was uncomfortable because I realized that I had been trusting the dollar unconditionally, totally, my entire financial life concentrated in it and denominated by it, and that I had never once decided that it was trustworthy. I had simply trusted it by default because it was the water I swam in, the reference point against which I measured everything, the thing so universal and so deep in my experience, that trusting it was not a decision I had made, but a default I had inherited. And watching others, sophisticated actors managing enormous positions, withdraw their trust for reasons I found entirely rational, I had to ask myself whether my own unconditional trust, granted by default and never examined, was itself rational. And I concluded that it was not. I concluded that unconditional, unexamined, total trust in any single system, however dominant, is not prudence, but a failure to examine a concentration, a blind spot masquerading as good sense. And so I stopped. I did not abandon the dollar, and I did not flee it in fear. I withdrew the unconditional default trust, the blind and total trust I had never chosen, and I replaced it with a considered, conditional, diversified stance, which is the only kind of trust in any single system that examination can actually justify. I stopped trusting the dollar in the specific sense of stopping the blind, unconditional, unexamined trust and beginning to hold it the way a thinking person should hold anything, conditionally, with awareness as one option among others, rather than as the unquestioned foundation of everything. And this points directly to what withdrawing that trust means in practice, because a change in trust that does not change how you are positioned is merely a change in mood, and the whole value of examining your trust is in what it leads you to do. To stop trusting the dollar unconditionally is to stop concentrating your entire economic existence in it, to stop holding all your wealth in a single claim whose value depends entirely on a single trust, and to diversify into things whose value does not depend on that one trust, into genuine productive assets grounded in real economic activity, into stores of value that are independent of any single system's trustworthiness, into a position that does not collapse if the trust you have withdrawn is one day withdrawn by everyone. The withdrawal of blind trust made practical is diversification, the reduction of concentration in a single monetary claim, the building of a position that is robust, is the very erosion of the very trust that the blind truster is entirely exposed to. The work of building a position out of genuine productive capability and stores of value independent of any single system's trust, rather than concentrating everything in one claim whose worth depends on one trust, is worth doing systematically, and there is a framework devoted precisely to that, called the sovereign vault. It is concerned with building durable, generationally significant wealth grounded in real productive assets and real institutional protection, the kind of position that does not depend on the continuation of a single unconditional trust, rather than in the concentration that the blind truster mistakes for safety. It is linked below, and the code on the screen will take you straight to it for anyone who wants to go deeper on the question of how to position yourself once you have stopped trusting any single system unconditionally. And that is the practical core of it, because withdrawing your trust means little if you remain out of habit, concentrated in exactly the claim your withdrawn trust would counsel against. I want to return to the dynamic of trust and how it moves, because it explains the specific shape that a monetary transition takes, the shape that is captured in the pattern of slowly and then suddenly. Trust erodes gradually at first, in the early phase, as rational actors quietly reduce their dependence and build their alternatives. And this early erosion is slow and undramatic and largely invisible to those who are trusting by default, because it does not announce itself and does not produce any visible crisis. It produces only the gradual construction of alternatives and the gradual reduction of dependence. And then at some point, when the erosion has proceeded far enough, some trigger, some event or combination of events causes the trust to move discontinuously, to cascade. Because trust is self-reinforcing, and once enough of it has been withdrawn, the remaining trust becomes fragile and can break quickly, as each actor, seeing others withdraw, has reason to withdraw as well, and the gradual erosion becomes a rapid repricing. This is why reserve currency transitions are slow, because trust and the network effects that support it are sticky, and the momentum of earned trust is powerful. And it is also why the final phase, when it comes, is fast, because trust that has been eroding gradually finally breaks discontinuously. The transition that unfolded slowly for years appears at the end to unfold very fast, and the person who withdrew their unconditional trust early, while the erosion was still gradual, is positioned when the cascade comes, while the person who trusted by default until the trust broke is caught in the rapid phase with no preparation. I want to think honestly about why people keep trusting unconditionally, why the blind default trust persists even as the erosion becomes visible. Because understanding the mechanism is the only defense against being captured by it. The first reason is that the trust is invisible, because it is universal and lifelong, and an invisible trust cannot be examined because you do not know you are granting it. The currency feels as though it has intrinsic value, the number in the account feels solid and real, and the trust that actually underlies that feeling is so deep and so unquestioned that the question of whether to grant it never even arises. The second reason is that withdrawing trust feels disloyal and alarmist and fringe, that the person who says they have stopped trusting the currency is easily categorized as a crank or a pessimist, and the social cost of the withdrawal and of saying so is real, and it keeps people granting the default trust and dismissing those who question it. And the third reason, the deepest, is the sheer comfort of not having to examine the foundation, because trusting by default requires nothing, no effort, no discomfort, no confrontation with the unsettling truth that the foundation of your financial life is a shared belief that can shift, while examining the trust requires the effort of asking a question you would rather not ask and confronting an answer you would rather not face. People keep trusting the dollar not because they have concluded that it is trustworthy, but because they have never asked the question, and the question is uncomfortable, and the default is comfortable. And comfort, as always, is a powerful force for leaving unexamined the things that most need examining. I want to be very clear about what I am not saying because the misreadings here are dangerous and I want to foreclose them. Stopping trusting the dollar, in the sense I mean, is not the same as betting on its collapse, and it is not doom, and it is not a conspiracy theory, and it is not the abandonment of the currency. The dollar will survive. Its position is supported by powerful network effects and by genuine continuing strengths, the depth and liquidity of American markets, the real economic and technological and military capacity that still underlies it, and the simple absence of a ready alternative that combines the necessary scale and trust. The dollar will survive, and I still use it, and I am not predicting its death. What I stopped trusting is not the dollar's survival, but its worthiness of unconditional, unexamined, total trust. And that is a very different thing. And I want to be equally clear that this is not a claim that some other currency is trustworthy. Instead, that one should transfer the blind trust from the dollar to some alternative, because that would be merely to relocate the error, to grant to a different single system the unconditional trust that the whole reflection is arguing against. The point is not to trust something else unconditionally. The point is to withdraw unconditional trust from any single system, to stop granting the blind default to anything, and to diversify accordingly, holding a considered and conditional trust in multiple things, rather than a blind and total trust in one. So I want to end, as I always do, not with an exhortation, but with an invitation to see clearly, because this is, in the end, one of the oldest truths there is about money, and it is not new. Money is trust all the way down, and trust is contingent, and it can be examined and withdrawn, and every currency that was ever trusted absolutely eventually met a reckoning, because unconditional trust in any single monetary arrangement has never once, in all of history, proven permanently justified. This is not new. What is new is only the specific circumstance, the particular erosion of trust in the dollar that I observed being conducted quietly and rationally by others in Asia, and the particular moment in which the gap between the slowly deteriorating fundamentals and the still largely intact trust is widening. I stopped trusting the dollar. And here is the final thing, the thing that makes the whole shift a matter of clear sight rather than fear. I did not stop using it, and I did not stop believing it will survive, and I did not transfer my blind trust to something else. I stopped trusting it unconditionally, blindly, by default, and I began holding it the way a thinking person should hold anything, with awareness of what it actually is, a shared belief that can shift, and with a position diversified enough that the shift, if it comes, does not take me with it. And the value of that examined conditional trust, invisible for a long time, the way these things always are, through the stretch in which the default trust still holds, and the person who examined theirs appears merely an unfashionable skeptic, reveals itself the way the erosion of trust always reveals itself, which is slowly, through the long gradual withdrawal that those trusting by default never notice. And then suddenly, at the moment, the trust finally cascades and the currency is repriced against the alternatives. And the people who withdrew their unconditional trust early, replacing it not with panic, but with considered diversification, are found to have been, all along, simply the ones who understood that money was never anything more or anything less than trust.